Introducing Rabbi Joel Zeff at 10 o'clock sharp on Wednesday morning. So we zip along with Zoom with the Friday Shkola. Rabbi Zeff, introduce your topic today.
Yeah, so this is actually part two of our discussion of humor, the theological significance of humor, or we could call it the divine comedy, which is borrowing an expression from a different context. In any case, we'll do a little review of what we discussed last week, and then we'll go on. And as a matter of fact, I just remembered now that I think the sources were distributed, but I also pulled them up as a screen share. So I'm just going to do that right now. So just give me one moment. Pull that up. Okay, and we'll do a screen share here. And let's see here. Okay. Now, what do you see? Does everybody see it says benign violation theory?
Yep.
Okay. So the first thing we did last week was to discuss how is humor understood scientifically in the realm of psychology. There are actually people who devote their lives to studying these things. And there's even something called the Humor Research Lab, which discusses this. And the most common and compelling theory is something that is called benign violation theory. We discussed this last week. What does benign violation theory suggest? That you have to have a confluence of two factors in order for something to be funny. One of them is there has to be a violation, and the other one is that it has to be benign. What are those two things? Violation, we said, is when a person runs up against two things that seem contradictory or threatening. So, for instance, right, we gave the example, if you see a baby wearing a three-piece suit, or you see an adult running around in a diaper, right? So those are things that don't seem to go together, right? Adults don't wear baby diapers, and babies don't wear three-piece suits. So that is humorous because it's a violation of norms, it's a violation of expectations. The same thing being tickled, we point out. That's also a violation. It's like, I don't want anybody touching me. So somebody is tickling you, it's a violation. But then you need another factor. It has to be benign. And that means that it's not something which particularly upsets you. Either it's something that happened a long time ago, so you're not upset by it, or it's something that happens to somebody that you don't particularly care about. But if it was something that happened to you and it's too close in time, like Mark Twain said, as we pointed out last week, that humor is tragedy plus time. Right? So you have to have a certain distance from it, either in time or because it's not happening to you. So if you see somebody walking along the street and falling into a manhole, some people consider that to be funny. But if it was your brother, you might not consider it to be funny. Or if it was telling somebody what happened to you yesterday, it might not be funny. Maybe something 5 years ago that happened to you, that might be funny. So we have the violation and benign, they have to come together, right? But if it's malign, right, something that hurts, then it's no longer funny. Okay, so then we went on to discuss the first time in the Torah where we encounter the notion of something being funny, and that is the Torah's use of the word tzchok, laughter, when Abraham is informed by Hashem that he is going to have a baby, and he laughs. We see that word used a whole bunch of times in the vicinity of that particular episode, and by Sarah, when Sarah overhears the angels telling Abraham that in a year he's going to have a baby, so she laughs. Interestingly enough, and famously, those two laughters are interpreted differently. The laughter of Abraham is interpreted by the vast majority of the commentators as something which is a laughter of joy, and the laughter of Sarah is interpreted as a laughter of disbelief. Like, that's ridiculous. And that's reflected by Targum Onkelos. That Targum Onkelos uses two different words to express the laughter of Avram on the one hand and Sarah on the other hand. The word which is used with regard to Avram, this is all just a quick review, is chadi, the Aramaic word chadi, which is like in Hebrew chedva, which means joy. So Avram expressed joyously, this laughter of being filled with joy, whereas with Sarah, the Aramaic, the Targum Onkelos, uses the word v'chayechat Sarah, the same word that has a Hebrew cognate, chiyuch. Chiyuch in Hebrew means to smile. L'chayech means to smile. So in Aramaic, that's the word which is used to describe Sarah's laughter, but it has a sense in Aramaic of a kind of a laughter of disbelief in Aramaic. And like I said, Rashi interprets it this way, Ramban interprets it this way. Everybody seems to interpret the same Hebrew word, tzchok, as meaning something quite different in regards to Avram and regards to Sarah. Now, we also saw that Ramban, amazingly enough, explains the theory of humor in exactly the same way that modern psychology understands it, the benign violation theory of humor. He said that anybody who sees something, and I quote, davar nifla. Nifla means amazing, can't be, right? That means violation, a violation of expectation, a violation of a norm, a violation of myself, like someone tickling me, right? And then he says, if you see something which is nifla, right, amazing, but it has to be letov, has to be good, meaning benign. Mamash, the exact same words of this modern theory, benign violation theory, in the Ramban. I'll just quote the whole phrase. Kol ro'eh davar nifla ba'adam. Anybody who sees something concerning a person which is nifla, amazing, right, violation, letovlo, as long as it's good, right, then it's considered to be funny. Okay, so interesting correspondence there between the understanding of Ramban, what makes something funny, and this contemporary theory of what makes something funny. And then we started to discuss the punchline of our whole discussion, and that is Rav Hirsch. Rav Hirsch it says something quite amazing. Rav Hirsch, first of all, starts out by saying that the way everybody has understood laughter in terms of Abraham versus laughter in terms of Sarah, that in terms of Abraham, it was an expression of joy. In terms of Sarah, it was an expression of ridiculous disbelief. That's wrong. So Hirsch says. Now, by the way, that's pretty amazing for a 19th century biblical commentator to take on Rashi, Ramban, and basically everybody else, Targum Onkelos. Right? So that's Rav Hirsch was very firmly entrenched in Orthodox traditional belief. So it is interesting that he takes on basically all the Rishonim and interprets this notion of laughter with regards to Avram and Sarah in a different way. And he actually suggests that the word tzchok doesn't mean joy. So when Targum Onkelos says, and Avram laughed, it means Avram expressed joy. It's not what it means at all. And in regards to Sarah, when it expressed somehow this skepticism, not necessarily. So Hirsch is now going to tell us what it really means. And he does a typical Hirschian thing, and that is Rav Hirsch was very interested in the Hebrew language. And he has this whole theory about how different words are related by peeling down to the roots of those words, the three-letter roots, and showing how different letters can switch in Hebrew from one to the other, mostly as a function of where those letters are produced in the mouth. And then you can understand the connection between different words and understand the deeper meaning of those words. So, for instance, he points out that we have the words sachak, which is the term used with regards to both Avraham and with regards to Sarah. They both sachak, that Hebrew word. In modern Hebrew, we use it a lot. You know, matzchik, he's funny. Or tzachakti, I laughed. Sachak. But then you have another word, sachak, with a sin. So, l'sachek in modern Hebrew has the sense of to play. A mischak is a game. So Rav Hirsch suggests that those two words are really the same root. despite the fact that one is Tzadik Chet Kuf and the other one is Sin Chet Kuf, they are only different between the first letter, Tzadi or Sin, which Rav Hirsch suggests that those letters are interchangeable, creating nuances, but nuances of the same idea. But then he takes it even further. He points out two other words, Tza'ak, Tzadi Ayin Guf, and Sha'ag, Shin Ayin Gimel. Now, Tza'ak is usually translated to cry out. And Sha'ag, Shin Aleph Gimel, means to roar like a lion. To roar like a lion. So Hirsch says those are all the same root, just with letters that can be exchanged because they're produced in the same part of the mouth to create nuances of meaning. You can sort of see this because tzchok, to laugh, schok, right, to play, right? To schok can mean to express joy, right? It's also this expression of joy, laughter. Sa'ak, to cry out. That's also to emit a strong emotion. And sha'ag, to roar. It's also a sound of a kind of spontaneous expression of some type of deep emotion. Now, what's the difference between those words? That's what we're going to get into now. And this is just still a review, believe it or not. It was a week ago. Who knows how much you remember from then, and who knows what was clear then. In any case, so Rav Hirsch suggests that you can divide these words into two categories, schok and schok, right? So normally translated say, play and laughter on the one hand, and sa'ak and sha'ag, so to cry out or to roar. The difference between those two categories, one category has a chet in the middle, Hebrew letter chet, and the other category has a different letter, either ayin or aleph. And he's going to suggest that the difference between those two categories is whether or not what's being dealt with is benign. We go back to the benign violation theory. So if something is humorous, we'll discuss what humor means in a moment, then it's tzadi, kuf, chet, kuf, tzachak. But if something is violation, and it's not benign, it's scary, it's malign, then it's tza'ak. I'm crying out in pain. So these Hebrew words are reflecting the benign violation theory, so that the difference between tzachak and tza'ak is, do we have the quality of being benign or malign? Benign, tzachak. Malign, tza'ak. Laughter, cry out. So now Rav Hirsch then says, so what makes something benign or malign? And he says the same thing Ramban says, and the same thing that contemporary psychology says. And that is, it's encountering something that doesn't make sense, ridiculous, like an adult wearing a diaper, a child wearing a three-piece Brooks Brothers suit. And it has to be benign. That's what makes something which evokes the response of tzachak. Okay. Now, Rav Hirsch then goes on, and he says, why does Abraham respond to the news he's going to have a baby with the Hebrew word tzachak? Well, using our benign violation theory, it's a confluence of, on the one hand, something ridiculous, right? Doesn't make sense. It's a violation of expectation, of norms, of natural law, of my body, right? On the other hand, also benign. So he says, think about Abraham. So Abraham, it's not just that he's old. It's that they've been trying to have a baby for a long time. People happily lived a long time back then. So it's not just that he's old and Sarah's old, but that they have been trying for a long time to have a baby. And it hasn't been happening. So this is ridiculous. This is something, there's an absurdity in the fact that he is now being told that he's going to have a baby. But there's something else which is absurd here. So this baby is born when he's an old man. Avram's an old man. Sarah is an old woman. This baby is taking on a tremendous mission. And that mission is to lead the Jewish people to their agenda, their destiny of saving the world. The Jewish people exist in order to fix the world, that the whole world should be blessed through the presence of the Jewish people, through the actions of the Jewish people, to fix what happened in Gan Eden. In Gan Eden, everything went south. Adam and Chava ruined everything. The Jewish people are coming to fix everything. So look at how this nation is beginning. Avram's just a single guy. There's supposed to be a nation coming from him. Yitzchak is the beginning of the building of that nation. So Yitzchak doesn't come on the scene until he's an old man. When is Avram going to teach Yitzchak about that destiny? It's a good chance that Avram is going to croak before he has a chance to teach Yitzchak about what it means to be a Jew and the agenda and destiny of the Jewish people. That's absurd. And this whole thing now, for so many different reasons, produces in Abraham the response to something being a violation of norms, expectations of that which is reasonable. It's a violation, right? Using that psychological theory. And obviously, it's benign. It's more than benign. It's, this is wonderful news, right? It's ridiculously wonderful. It's a benign violation, ridiculously wonderful. Okay, fine. So now we're going to continue with Rav Hirsch's explanation. And this is just it knocked my socks off. And I hope it does it for you as well. So I have the Hirsch here in English translation, since it was written in German originally. So as we pointed out last week, might as well just look at it in English translation instead of Hebrew translation, because it's all a translation. This will be easier for most people. Let me just expand this a little bit, the text. Let's see. I could make it maybe even a little bit bigger. Okay, so now we are on where it's the last paragraph in the left column, where it says, according to all. According to all the natural conditions of cause and effect, meaning that if this was not a violation, if this was the normal way nature operates, right? The whole beginning of the Jewish people, its history, its expectations, its hope, its whole life, based on these hopes, must appear as the most unwarranted, laughable pretension. Meaning, the whole notion of what the Jewish people is about is a violation. It doesn't fit into a reasonable understanding of cause and effect. The notion that a tiny little nation is going to redeem the world from the mess of sin and of corruption is an absurd and pretentious claim. And that absurdity is rooted in the very beginning of the Jewish people, which is the transition from Avram to Yitzchak. That the very birth of the first flowering of the Jewish nation, that Avram has offspring, is rooted in absurdity, expresses that absurdity in the circumstances of the birth of Yitzchak. Let's read the next sentence. It's laughable, ridiculous. It's a benign violation. It only makes sense, yea, it can then be reckoned with certainty, when it reckons on the deeply infringing, completely free almighty will and free-willed mighty power of a free-willed almighty God as the basis of its opinion. Now let me just translate that into English. It is English, but it's hard to understand what he's saying. There's only one way to understand the absurd pretentiousness of the Jewish people and the absurdity of our history, which defies any cause and effect, natural explanation, is that there must be some force operating outside of the realm of cause and effect. There must be some providential guiding hand that is free of being limited to natural law, cause and effect. Who is that? G-D. God exists above nature. God is not subservient to any natural considerations of cause and effect. So the very absurdity of what the Jewish people is about, the very absurdity of our history, beginning with the transition for Avraham and Yitzchak, is a testimony to the existence of God, particularly the providential existence of God, how God operates in the world, especially through the Jewish people. Existence is absurd, and that absurdity itself is a testimony to He, with a capital H, that exists outside the realm of the reasonable, outside of the realm of rational, outside of the realm of orderly transition of cause and effect. Now let's read on. This is just an amazing, amazing idea. That was to be brought home to the minds of our ancestors already beforehand, meaning God wanted us to know from the very outset that our pretenses are absurd, our history and destiny are absurd. They go beyond expectation, they go beyond that which is reasonable, they go outside of the realm of cause and effect. And that testifies to the providential guiding hand of He that exists outside of the realm of cause and effect. We have to know that from the outset. That is a foundational frame of mind that we have to appreciate, that the absurdity of what we're about is itself a testimony to God. By the way, you may have heard of the famous historian Arnold Toynbee. Arnold Toynbee, who was a very, very famous historian, tried to explain the rise and fall of civilizations, and being someone who considered himself a scientist, a social scientist, right? He's trying to understand history based upon science, cause and effect. He had a theory about how nations are subject to a rule of rise and then ultimate decline. Arnold Toynbee happened to be a tremendous anti-Semite, and he regarded the Jewish people as some type of abnormality that threatened his theory, because the Jewish people don't seem to go up and then go down and disappear. We have ups and downs in terms of how, to what extent we flourish, are persecuted, etc. But we don't disappear. How come we don't have this kind of linear rise and then decline? And Toynbee felt that really we should disappear, and that's the trajectory. But we are having the last laugh, as it were, against Toynbee. Now, take a look at what Rav Hirsch now has to say. Let me just turn off this phone, please. Okay. This was to be brought home to the minds of our ancestors already beforehand, and that fact was to remain in the minds of all their descendants. That was why God waited for the first seed of this nation to be laid until the absurd age of its ancestors. Why did God make sure that Abraham would be an old man and Sarah would be an old woman, and that Yitzhak would be born under absurd circumstances? To implant in our minds the very absurdity of what we are about from the very beginning of the flowering and sprouting of our nation. That was why he waited to fulfill his promise until all human hopes of its realization had ended. God wanted to wait until it would be ridiculous. And that at that moment of being ridiculous, Yitzhak is born. Because that is the leitmotif of Jewish history and destiny, absurdity. And schok is the response to absurdity. For it was a question of creating a nation from which, from the beginning to the end of its existence, was to be, even by its very existence, in opposition to all the ordinary laws of world history. The whole texture of our existence is ridiculous, is absurd, in opposition to any comprehensible laws of cause and effect. And this is an intimation of God in the midst of mankind, because only God operates in his providential guidance, unbounded, utterly free of any concern for cause and effect. And therefore, up to the present day, to the narrow-minded deniers of God, appears as the most absurd absurdity. Right? To those scoffers, those anti-Semites, we are absurd, and of course, absurd from their perspective in a way which means we really shouldn't exist. The loud laugh that has followed the path of the Jews throughout the course of their history is a true proof of the divine nature of this path. It does not disturb them, as they were prepared for this laughter beforehand. We've been prepared from the birth of Yitzchak to see in the very absurdity of our history and destiny evidence of God's providential presence in this ridiculous and absurd world in which we live. Amazing idea. So according to Rav Hirsch, Yitzchak is called Yitzchak. I mean, just think about it. Why is he called Yitzchak? That's a pretty weird name to name your kid. Now, think about this. Not just laughter and not joy, right? The other Rishonim say Yitzchak really means joy. According to Rav Hirsch, it's not really joy, and it's not just laughter in some kind of undefined sense. It is the sound which erupts forth from us when we encounter the absurd, as long as it's benign. Therefore, the second patriarch of the Jewish people, the first step that gives evidence of the fact that a nation is going to be created from Abraham, is called Mr. Absurd. If you wanted to translate Yitzchak's name to somebody who didn't know Hebrew, and you wanted to do it in light of Rav Hirsch, you would call him Absurd, Mr. Absurd. So the three founding fathers of the Jewish people are Abraham, Absurd, and Yaakov. That's amazing. And the reason is because God wanted to know from the outset that this is all absurd. Our pretenses, our history, and our destiny are all absurd, which then points to and gives evidence to God's providential care, which is free from considerations of cause and effect. Okay, now I'm going to pause here just for a moment before we go on to take any questions on what we said so far. Any concerns or questions on what we said so far? Whoa, what happened? Bruce, I'm shocked. This is absurd. Okay, your wife won't let you talk. Okay. The Seder. Okay. Now, I want to take this one step further. And what I'm saying now is based upon Hirsch, but I'm developing it slightly. We talked about 4 different verbs. Sachak, sachak with a sin, petku, like l'sachek. Sa'ak, to cry out. Sha'ag, which is to roar. I want to talk a little bit about the first 2 verbs. Sachak versus sin, petku, l'sachek. Schok. So according to Rav Hirsch, schok is the visceral response to benign violation, to something absurd. And Yitzchak is Mr. Absurd. Now watch this. We're going to take a look at a very famous chapter of Tehillim, of Psalms. Everybody here knows it. Shir Amalo Peshuv Hashem et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kechomim. Right, we say this before we say Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals. And what does it say? Peshuv Hashem et Shivat Zion. When Hashem returns the Jewish people to the land of Israel, the ultimate redemption, Hayinu Kechomim, we will be like dreamers. Now, it's interesting to note off the top, a dream is the perfect circumstance to describe a framework in which we can experience the absurd. In a dream, you can have elephants flying. You can have things happen. You can experience them, which seem to be impossible. Don't conform to expectation, to norms, to cause and effect, natural law. Redemption will be kichomi. We're going to experience that, the absurdity, but it's going to be reality. Dream. Now look at this. What's going to happen then? How are we going to respond? Az yimale schok pinu. Then our mouths will be filled with schok. Schok. What's schok? So Rav Hirsch suggests that when the notion of absurdity was a response to the claim of what the Jewish people will accomplish, the notion of redemption, that's tzchok with a tzadi. It's this visceral response to something which is absurd. But from our perspective, it's benign. That's an understatement. Testifies to the existence of God. When it's no longer an abstraction, when it's no longer just a promise, when it's actualized, schok becomes schok. The tzadi becomes a sin. The laughter becomes, rather than an encounter with absurdity, it becomes the joyous expression of the actualization of that formerly absurd claim. The visceral response to the actualization of what had been formerly some absurd promise. We witness redemption, and instead of tzok, it's schok. Now watch this. A difficult pasuk in Yirmiyahu, in the prophet Jeremiah. And you'll see something fascinating. Yirmiyahu is telling the Jewish people that despite all of the tragedies facing the Jewish people, Yirmiyahu is the prophet of doom and gloom. If you want to be in a good mood, don't learn Yirmiyahu, or at least a lot of it. But that same Yirmiyahu, who is the prophet of destruction, also informs us that, as absurd as it may sound, that the Jewish people will rise again, fulfill their destiny, and redemption will occur. And he promises us it in the following poetic language. Ko amar Hashem, im lo vriti yomam v'layla, kukot shamayim v'aretz lo samti. Just like I have a covenant with day and night, with heaven and earth, right? Laws of nature. They happen, right? The sun rises in the morning, it sets in the evening. There's heavens up there, there's earth down here. So that is a covenant which is unalterable. And in the same surety that the sun rises in the morning and sets at night, the following is true as well. Gamzer Yaakov David Avdi Emas mikachet mezaro moshlim ozer Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov ki yashiv et shutam richamtim. Prophet says the following. Just like I'm not going to stop the sun from rising and setting at the end of the day, I'm not going to stop the heavens from being up here and the earth down there. So too, I will make sure that David Avdi, David my servant, Mashiach, will never, ever be subject to mi'us, to being abhorred. And the descendants of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov will morph into their position of greatness of rulers. And I will return the Jewish people of Arichamtim and have mercy upon them. Now it's interesting. This passage here, which describes the redemption of the Jewish people, refers to our forefathers, whose vision, whose destiny is of redemption for the Jewish people and for the world. Look how they're referred to. Abraham, look carefully, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Everybody see that? What do you notice? Yitzchak has morphed into Yitzchak. Yitzchak is called Yitzchak because he reflects the absurdity of the promise in the face of painful reality. But when we experience the actualization of that promise of redemption, he's no longer called Yitzchak, he's Yitzchak. Joyful laughter, just like we saw in Tehillim, Az Yimalei Schok Pinu. then our mouths will be filled with joyous laughter. So Yitzchak, who's Mr. Absurd, becomes Mr. Expression of joyous laughter. Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. Yitzchak will be no longer referred to as Yitzchak, but Yitzchak. Ready to hear this idea? It's a absolutely marvelous notion. Right? Just in case you didn't follow the Hebrew translation of Jeremiah, I didn't have it up on the screen, so they're difficult psukim. We'll just read it in English just so you see this idea. So said the Lord, if not my covenant with the day and night that the statutes of heaven and earth I did not place, also will I reject the seed of Jacob and David, my servant, not to take from his seed rulers over the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I bring back their captivity and mercy upon them. It's double negative. It's hard to understand. It means, right, it's that I will not change nature, and in the same way, that the same surety will apply to the ultimate redemption. It's not a negative. If you look at verse 26 by itself, you would think God's saying that I will not take from his seed rulers, right? I will reject. It's the exact opposite, right? But it's a little difficult to see that within if you see it by itself. But if we look at 25 and 26 together, you'll see that God's saying, just like I'm not going to stop heaven from being over the earth, so too I'm certainly not going to reject the seed of Jacob and David, blah 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 blah, etc. Okay. In the final, now, any questions on anything we said so far before we go on? Okay. So now what I want to do is take this idea that we just developed about humor, which basically is the leitmotif of what we're all about. This is really amazing, according to this theory of Rav Hirsch. That to use the term divine comedy is a very apt term, according to Rav Hirsch. I want to take the idea as developed by Rav Hirsch, and I want to address a very interesting passage in the Talmud using a word that we haven't discussed yet. We've discussed a lot of different Hebrew words, sachak, right? Sa'ak. That's what you're crying out because it's not benign, it's malign, etc. We discussed the word a little bit, chiyuch. Right? That's the Aramaic word which is used to describe how many Meforshim, but Rav Hirsch understand how Sarah responded. There's another word. If I ask you in modern Hebrew, how do you say a joke? Or someone who's funny? In modern Hebrew, you use the word bidicha. A bidicha is a joke. A jester is a badchan. In Yiddish, you say a badchan. People used to have at weddings, they would hire professional comedians who would entertain the guests at weddings. It's called a badchan. Talmud tells an interesting story, very famous passage in the Talmud. And we'll do this by just cutting to the chase. The Talmud is examining the book of Kohelet. The book of Kohelet is not funny. Okay. Parts of Megillat Esther are funny. Kohelet is not funny. And you may be aware that the Talmud has a discussion that Kohelet is not only not funny, but also seems to say contradictory things. One of the contradictory things that the Talmud addresses is the role of joy. Is joy good for the Jews? Is joy good? Let's look at the very beginning of this passage in the Talmud. Amar Rav Yehuda Berei Darav Shmuel Bar Shilat Mishmei Darav. Bikshu Chachamim Lignoz Sefer Kohelet. The sages sought to hide away the book of Kohelet. Got to get rid of it. Dangerous book. B'nei Dvarav Sotrin Zeh Zeh. It has contradictory elements, confusing, could lead people to think strange things. Umay Dvarav Sotrim Zedzeh. So what's an example of how there are inner contradictions in the book of Kohelet? Give you one. Ketiv says in one place in Kohelet, V'shibachti ani et simcha. I praised simcha. Simcha, one joy, wonderful thing. Joy is great. Uchtiv, the only problem is, in a different chapter in Kohelet, it says, U'lesimcha mazeh oseh. And simcha mazeh oseh. What good is simcha? That's speaking in a negative way about simcha, about levity, joy, levity. So, what do you do about that? Is joy good for the Jews? Is levity good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? By the way, that's just an aside. Jews are known to be very prominent in the field of humor. A lot of comedians are Jewish, and I think the field of comedy was really founded in the Borscht Belt, that whole world. Those were Jews, right? So I wonder if in some way, perhaps not even conscious, that this notion of humor as being kind of a confrontation with the absurd is something that, because we have it like in our DNA from Yitzhak on, right? That kind of understanding the absurdity of life. Just an aside. So we have this contradiction. Is levity good for the Jews, bad for the Jews? Two contradictory verses in the book of Kohelet. And the Talmud, of course, tries to resolve it. And it resolves it by saying, well, it depends, right? So if you're experiencing levity in the context of a mitzvah, as the Talmud says in the next paragraph, V'shibachti ani et simcha. The verse that says, I have praised simcha, simcha shel mitzvah. So that's levity in the context of a mitzvah. The verse that says, Ulesimcha ma zo oseh, and what good is simcha? Zo simcha she'ena shel mitzvah. That's levity, which is not in the context of a mitzvah. That sounds like a very Jewish and orthodox way of, Talmudic way of understanding the distinction between good levity and bad levity. Then the Talmud goes on. L'lamedcha. This teaches us something interesting. She'ein shchina shora, elamitoch dvar simcha shel mitzvah. That the divine presence only dwells when you have simcha shel mitzvah, when you have levity and joy, which is associated with a mitzvah, and it quotes a pasuk from Malachim, in which we have the prophet saying, look, I want to have the Shekhinah devolve upon me so I can prophesize, but I'm kind of in a bad mood. No simcha. So he says, V'ata kachuli menagain. I need a musician. Bring in a musician. V'haya kinagain amenagain v'ti alav yad Hashem. And when the musician would come in and play this fantastic music, and now I'm dancing and singing and in a good mood, then Yad Hashem, this prophetic presence of Shekhinah, devolves upon me. Now, the Talmud said that this crucial nature of simcha, it's a necessary prerequisite for prophecy, simcha shel mitzvah. Amar Rav Yehuda, v'chein ledvar halacha. Same thing for learning halacha. You want to understand halacha, you want to understand Torah, you better experience levity first, simcha. So the Talmud goes on and says that, like when you learn Torah, you're learning halacha in a Beit Midrash, you're going to learn, like you just did a few minutes ago, the different halachot of davening. Supposed to make jokes out of it. Doesn't sound kosher to me. So the Talmud says, if you use it properly, yes. How so? It's the way you should preface the shiur. And it tells the story. I'm going to skip just a few lines down to the bottom of that second paragraph. Ki hadarabba. We're going to show how levity is necessary presence for learning halacha, but it has to be before. Ki hadarabba. It's like Rabbah. Mikame de patach lehu Rabbanan. Before he would start his shiur teaching the laws of davening, as an example. I'm just making that up, the laws of davening, just because that's his previous shiur. Amar milta de b'dichuta. He would say a joke. Milta de b'dichuta. Milta means davar, a matter de b'dichuta, of humor, of a joke, like in modern Hebrew, b'dicha. Ubatche Rabbanan, and all the rabbis who crack up. L'sof yetiv be'emta ufatach b'shmata. And then he'd become very serious and start to give his shiur. Why is it necessary to begin with a joke? So the truth of the matter is that there are many explanations why it's so important to begin with a joke. I just want to show you something. It's not normally a source I would quote. Wikipedia, the next source, Wikipedia. I'm quoting it to show you because it just exemplifies the normal way this is understood. Why to begin with a joke? So the Wikipedia article on this idea of starting with a joke says, among the Amorim, like Rabbi we just saw, would begin their shiurim with telling a joke. In order to make sure that the people participating in the shiur are awake. So I just want to wake them up, so I tell a joke. Now, by the way, every public speaker does this. You begin with a joke, just wake everybody up. Okay. So that is a typical way of understanding this idea. That's the way in the world. A good speaker, not even you're giving a shiur, just speaker, tell a joke, wake everybody up. You're going to see that I don't believe that's correct. And other great commentators in the Talmud suggested other explanations, which I'm not convinced of the correctness of their view. The Pnei Yoshua, Rabbi Yeshua Falk, is one of the great commentators on halacha. And when he explains this, he says it can't be that Rabbah told the joke. He couldn't imagine that Rabbah, this great personality among the Amoraim, would tell a joke. Was this the Borscht Belt, one of those hotels there where they have these Jewish comedians? That was Rabbah. So instead he says that maybe what it meant is something a little bit different. Not just a joke, but actually to learn something in Torah which is a little bit easier to understand, or perhaps slightly amusing, right? Like Haggadah, right? And then go into halacha. It doesn't mean he told a joke. Okay? But the Balatanya seems to have a different approach. The Balatanya seems to understand that the joke itself can be something holy. But he doesn't explain exactly how. Though he alludes to it. He says, lefakeach dato, to open up the mind. Lefakeach means to open up. Like pokeach ivrim, the bracha we say in the morning, Hashem opens up the eyes of the blind. That you tell a joke to open up the mind. I don't think that means just to wake up. I think maybe something much deeper. Do you remember the last topic we discussed was, what is the definition of Torah Lishma? We saw the Vilna Gaon and Rav Kook, who I think explained it even better with all the respect to the Vilna Gaon, said, Torah Lishma means you're learning Torah for the sake of Torah, meaning we're learning Torah in order to expand Torah, to bring new insight to Torah, to be creative in our learning of Torah, so that the wisdom of the Torah, which is hidden in the Torah, becomes expressed. becomes revealed. So Torah Lishma means to learn Torah for the good of the Torah. So the Torah's meaning can be uncovered and expressed to the world. This requires particularly learning Torah in a creative manner, so that you can bring out new insight into Torah. That is the most pure expression of Torah Lishma, when you're learning Torah in a way which reveals a new insight. And Rav Kook went so far as to suggest that since we all bring our own experience and our own type of ways of thinking to Torah, it's particularly important that we all learn Torah so that each of us can reveal a different aspect of insight contained in the Torah as a function of our unique tools and experience that we bring to the learning of Torah. So the function of Torah Lishma is lahagdil Torah, to expand Torah by uncovering new insights. Now, I'd like to suggest that in light of Rav Hirsch's explanation of the function of humor, the function of humor is it's a response to something which was unexpected, unnatural, something that violates the status quo. What is chidush? Novel understanding of Torah. When I say chidush, what does that mean? I'm learning Torah, and I approach Torah with a certain assumption of it means X, Y, Z. That's what I learned from my Rebbe. That's what I learned from this book. That's the Torah's meaning. Chidush means I'm now looking at the Torah, and I've come up now with a surprising and novel, that's what the word chidush means, novel insight. That means thinking outside of the box. That means thinking in a way which breaks from the norm, which breaks from all prior assumptions. That's exactly the definition of humor, according to Rav Hirsch. It's breaking that which was from the norm, breaking that which is the assumption, breaking from that which is the expectation. That is the very underlying premise of what humor is all about. So therefore, perhaps we could suggest that Rabbah would begin his shiur in halacha with a milta de bidichuta, something humorous, as the Baal HaTanya said, in order to open the mind to the ability to experience the unexpected, to see in Torah that which goes beyond the norm, to see in Torah novelty, which breaks with what my assumptions were when I came to that piece of Torah. And therefore we begin to learn Torah with humor, because humor cultivates the ability to break out of assumption, to break out of normalcy, to break out of status quo. And that is the essential quality of learning Torah in a creative way, and that is the function of humor. And with that, we will stop, and I turn it over to Rav Chaim. Take care, everybody.
Take care. Thank you, Rabbi Zeph. See you next week.